On behalf of the summer project, today we deep dive into the topic of non-motorized transport. So NMT, a topic I am very passionate about. NMT, what is it? Can anyone name a kind of non-motorized transport? Bicycle, walking? Scooter, yeah. There's many clues in this picture, and it's in the name. Anything without a motor or an engine, like walking, cycling, small-wheeled transport, and that could be, say, a skateboard, but also maybe a street vendor who has a cart that doesn't have a motor, and a wheelchair is also non-motorized, at least some types of wheelchairs. And you often see non-motorized transport referred to as active mobility or human-powered transport. But the most common is NMT and active mobility. Today we'll really focus on walking, and we'll also talk a little bit about inclusivity, which will cover wheelchair travel. We won't cover cycling in much depth, not because cycling is not important, because it's another very big topic and we just won't have time. But in the future, if you're interested, we can do an extra session where we focus entirely on cycling. Why should we promote these different modes?
It
Reduces air pollution, yeah.
When you walk, you can share the idea.
Yeah. If you go to Wat Bottom in the morning, lots of people are walking, but they're not going somewhere. Why are they walking? For exercise. There's lots of different reasons. There's personal reasons. So I may walk for my fitness, and if I walk, I will benefit the environment, the air quality. Economically, if I walk to my destination instead of taking my motorbike or a tuk-tuk, I will save money. Walking is essentially free. The fuel you need is the food you eat. So there is a cost, but it's a small indirect cost. Socially, exactly, you can meet people. It's more interactive. And if everybody is walking, then that's quite good at a societal level. There'll be stronger communities. When you walk, you don't face congestion. And again, at a larger scale, if everybody in the city is walking, you reduce the amount of people potentially driving cars, which reduces congestion, but also having a very walkable city can also increase public transport ridership. Walking, active mobility, is great for short distances. It's not very practical for medium or long distances, but the majority of our trips are short distances. And everyone, including drivers, are pedestrians at some point in their lives or in their trip. If you own a car, you might have to walk to your car from your house, or when you arrive at your destination, you have to park your car and walk. So everyone benefits from having good walking pedestrian infrastructure, and it's also the most natural way of getting around. We are essentially born to walk, and walking is good for us, and walking is really the foundation of our transport system. And how can we promote walking and all kinds of non-motorized transport? Well, there's policies that we can introduce and also design practices that we can promote. And these should generally promote safety, inclusivity, so that everyone, regardless of their abilities, can navigate our streets and our cities, as well as accessibility. We need these policies and design practices adapted to the local Cambodian context, which is really the focus of our lecture today. By the end of today, I would like for you all to understand the very fundamentals of streets and know what complete streets are. Also, best practice street design. We will share with you many different examples. And then at the end, we will look at how we can promote non-motorized transport through tactical urbanism projects. So promoting NMT, that is a whole topic in itself that we could cover separately. It depends on, yes, how we design, but also on the governance, our regulations, our standards, our design guidelines, that is something we can maybe cover in the future if it's of interest. But when we talk about how to promote NMT, we will look at how us here today can come together, think of ideas, and potentially implement them at a small scale, which is what some of you have been supporting myself, Aaron, and MPWT with quite recently. And before we get into it, I derive a lot of my material in this presentation from mainly the Global Street Design Guide. This has all the information you could ever want or need, beautiful sketches, lots of case studies. It's really an excellent resource. For the Cambodian context, another fantastic resource that has been used to implement NMT projects is this report produced by ARUP and the World Bank. So if any of you have been to Siem Reap in the last 2 years, you probably noticed that the footpaths have been redesigned. There's also cycle paths, and they've really given Siem Reap a facelift, and the city looks very organized, very beautiful now. Today, I'd like to begin just by talking about the Cambodian context, or the Phnom Penh context. And for this, we will go for a little walk. I have a video showing you the streets that I live close to. Then we'll talk about the fundamentals. After that, we'll go into design best practice, and we'll cover how to make our streets safer, how to improve our footpaths and crossings, how to create integrated networks of footpaths and crossings. Then we'll talk about inclusivity and accessibility. Walking is something that you can probably do very comfortably, but also think of your little brother or sister. If he is 3 or 4 years old, can he walk safely? Less likely. Or if you have a grandparent who's over 70 years old, it's also important that they can comfortably navigate the streets. Also, vulnerable users. So people in wheelchairs, people who are blind, and there are many ways we can better design our streets for them, and not just thinking of streets as spaces for movement. They're also public spaces, and we can create more public spaces. And I think Phnom Penh would really benefit from more public space. Then I will talk about some international best practices. I have used Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, and I'll explain why later on. So, Cambodian context. Yesterday morning, I went for a walk. I live around here, and I had to buy some food. So this was my walk, and I made a video. I recorded it, and we will watch the video, and I want you to think about these different elements, and then we will score it. So it's not very scientific, but it's just to get us thinking.
Okay, good morning everybody. I wanted to take us on a little video walk where I would document my user experience as I go from my home to Super Duper to do some grocery shopping. It's exactly 8 a.m. on street 278. As you can see, I am walking in the middle of the road because I don't have a footpath. Now we're going on to street 63. A lot of street life, different businesses spill out onto the road and onto the footpath, which is why I have to walk on the road next to the vehicles, which I have to say can be a little bit stressful. And that's because these businesses serve the two-wheelers. Needless to say, every walk is exciting and interactive, but unnecessarily dangerous. And it seems the buildings are built with wide footpaths, but these become areas for parking, and little businesses pop up on what could be somewhat continuous footpaths, and it leaves no right of way, not even 1 or 2 meters where someone can walk. Here I reach an intersection. Today is Halloween. And here at this intersection, there are no pedestrian crossings. It's not signalized. And here we have, I suppose, a KTV with perpendicular parking, which means that all the parked vehicles will need to reverse backwards into the street, which will obstruct traffic flow. Generally, that's not good practice. Parallel parking is always favorable, although it does take up more space, but it also frees up space for walking. Also try to imagine, what if you are in a wheelchair? Can you navigate these city streets? Well, probably not. You would have to be on the road, and it would be very dangerous. Passing in front of this vehicle, for instance, they probably wouldn't see you. And now we will cross this street, which is never a pleasant experience. You have to enter the mixed traffic, and I'm used to it. If you think of an elderly person in their 70s having to navigate these streets, really not practical, but it's also not particularly dignified. And this experience I am having is the user experience for most of the city center of Phnom Penh, excluding a few of the more modern areas, say on Koh Pik, Diamond Island. There, the streets have been built to different standards.
There's many things we could do to improve this situation. But the first thing we need to do is understand what we are dealing with. So, out of 5, or 0 being not safe at all, 5 being safe, how do we feel my walk was? I will give it 1 point. Just because it didn't feel safe, but in 3 years, I've never had an accident. I feel like the vehicle flow is so obstructed in Phnom Penh that vehicles drive slow, that even though the situation is not good, it's not super dangerous. So 1 point for safety. How about comfort? It's true, it wasn't very comfortable, but it was possible to walk. That is something. You go to some cities in Southeast Asia, Jakarta, Bangkok, Manila, some places are impossible to walk in, but other places are quite good. So okay, maybe 2 for comfort. Another element that we have to factor is the surface that I was walking on. How was that? Smooth? Not so smooth? Shade? This was in the morning, so the sun wasn't high enough, but in the daytime, it gets quite hot. There are some trees, there is some shade, so shade is okay. Crossings, no crossings. Inclusive. Do you think this was inclusive for someone in a wheelchair? Connectivity. When I talk about connectivity, it's my ability to get from here to here and how easy that is. So it's a really well-connected city. Parking. So there is parking, but in the context of walking, parking is a big problem. It's something we really want to solve. Street life. So street life is shops, vendors, people relaxing. We saw people selling coffee, people fixing tires. So there's a lot of street life. That's a very good thing. And then furniture, which we'll revisit later. Furniture is like benches or signs, yeah, or a waste bin where you can throw away things. I saw no public furniture. And when we score it all together, I did this myself, I give it 10 out of 50. Not a very high score. But there is so much potential, and we'll explore that today, how we could potentially improve these kinds of streets and what kind of design practices we could and should explore. The footpaths are there. They used to be well used by pedestrians in a lot of the inner city areas. A lot of this is a legacy of the French urban planning. I couldn't find a year, but it's between 1940 and 1970. Most people were walking. You had some bicycles and cyclos. Cyclos were the tuk-tuk, the pasap of the time. And the city was designed for a much smaller population, and the infrastructure was built for walking. And at the time, there was no or very limited motorized transport. So Phnom Penh used to be a very sustainable city, and walking was very smooth, it was safe, it was seamless. As more and more motorbikes entered the city streets, more and more cars arrived, fewer and fewer people would walk. And so the businesses had to sell to people in vehicles, and it creates a strong incentive to move your shop, move your goods right to the edge of the footpath. And so they blocked all these footpaths that once existed because now they sell to people on motorbikes. I'm sure you do it, I do it, and because of motorization, which has happened as Cambodia has grown. Last week we spoke about growth and how your job is to absorb this growth. There's been a lot of urbanization, and the urbanization has happened with motorization. urbanization can be healthy or unhealthy. We explored last week what that looks like, and there's many examples of healthy urbanization in Cambodian cities, but also very unhealthy. So the healthy urbanization is when we limit urban expansion and we build vertically. We fit more people in a small amount of space. That's more sustainable, and that's densification. The opposite is sprawl, where we build low-density settlements which create more private car trips. And densification is good, but it has happened in a very uncontrolled fashion. And now there's an old urban plan built for I don't know how many thousands of people, but today it's the same urban plan with much taller buildings, way more vehicles, way more people, way more shops, and it's all happening in the same amount of space. And it's created quite a chaotic streetscape. A lot of good things are happening, but there's a lot of potential to really organize our street space. As Phnom Penh and many Cambodian cities have modernized, they've also motorized. That's not a bad thing, but it's happened in a way where the pedestrian environment has received very limited attention and investment. So today, there's a lack of walking infrastructure. The footpaths that exist are not wide enough for the potential amount of people walking, and they're also very obstructed. And so we could conclude the situation here with many areas have been designed as if pedestrians don't exist. When I walk around, it feels like no one has given any thought to my needs as a pedestrian. And what we need to do is find a better balance that would really improve the street environment for everybody. So that's sort of the context. And I think it's worth asking ourselves, what is a street? It's a very simple question, but streets are many different things. Any ideas? This is a street. From the building edge to the other building edge, this is our street, a cross section. We see the Khmer remorque drivers hanging out, looking for customers. We have two, maybe they're backpackers, I can't see. This could be a delivery driver. You have a street vendor who's looking for customers. You have many different things happening. And so basically, a street is a unit of space where people experience the city. In your life, you're either in a building, like we are right now, or you're in a street. And we all experience the streets very differently, depending on what we're doing. And streets are public spaces where people can hang out, like this guy. Doesn't look like he's going anywhere. He's just taking his selfie. While it's also a corridor for movement. So some people are using it as a public space. Some people are using it as a corridor for movement. And we should be designing them to cater to all the different uses. And so streets are not only spaces for vehicles. They're for lots of different activities. They're multifunctional spaces. And I mean, this is a bit poetic, but streets are the stage upon which the drama of life unfolds every day. But recently, they've been reduced to a more restricted role, where we've just been building and designing them for the movement of automobiles. So there's a lot of dynamics happening on many of our streets, and we should design for them. And streets are also dynamic. You can see how Central Market has changed in the last 100 or maybe 70 years. There's been a lot of urban development, a lot of densification. Here we have Soria Mall. There used to be very wide, unobstructed footpaths. Now they're mostly used by shops and for parking. There was trees. The market was expanded. The street space is dynamic. It changes over time. They often change around the prevailing mode of transport. So back then, you didn't need as much parking for vehicles, and that's what changed in 70 years. But they can also change very quickly. This was during the lockdown, the COVID lockdown. It was the first day when we were allowed out of our neighborhoods, out of the Sankats. So I went for a walk to Central Market, and Central Market was empty. There was very few cars, a couple cyclos. It was a completely different experience than if we were to go there today. And because the streets were empty, people emerged from their homes. They were playing football. Kids were cycling around Central Market. It was really special. It was really nice to see that. And it's because streets are dynamic. They can change over long periods of time, but they can also change instantly if we allow them to. But there are ways you can create that public space by using your street spaces differently. This is in Jakarta. Last week we saw a bus corridor in Jakarta, the Trans-Jakarta Bus Rapid Transit. This is the same corridor that moves probably multiple millions of people every single day. But every Sunday, they have a car-free day. From 6 a.m. to 11 a.m., they close this street and everyone goes out and walks, runs, cycles, does sport, and it's a way of using road space differently. So it's just a nice idea, and these kinds of things could be explored for Phnom Penh. But of course, we can't just close down streets permanently. Streets are very important. We need to move people, we need to move goods. And again, what we need to look at is how we can just better balance this with what we would have here today, a lot more traffic. And for that, what we need is to create complete streets. This is what many of the streets look like today, and it's not optimized because it's not organized. Whereas a complete street is a street that is much more organized and is designed around all the different uses. Well, look at what we can see here. The roadway here is narrower. There are parking bays. There's green infrastructure, so we see a tree here. The pedestrians have at-grade crossings, yeah. There's small ramps, so it's level. And there's bins, and there's many different features. And that's a complete street. And we will really look at all the different elements of a complete street. A complete street is essentially, it's a policy and it's a design approach that requires streets to be planned, designed, operated, and maintained to enable smooth, safe, and seamless travel for all users of all abilities. And if we can create complete streets, we can reduce road traffic accidents, reduce air pollution, reduce energy consumption, reduce inequity, and increase inclusivity. We can increase public space, and we can also increase public transport ridership. So these are all things I think we can all agree are worth striving towards. But now what we need is to know some street design best practices to make these nice thoughts a reality. We can design our streets to increase safety, and we'll look at how we can do that. And we'll also look at how we can design footpaths and crossings to improve the non-motorized transport environment. We'll look at networks of footpaths and crossings and how that can enhance overall non-motorized transport mobility, then accessibility and public space. So first things first, safety. Safety is obviously a very relevant topic, unfortunately. In 2019, 5.4 people died a day in Cambodia in road traffic accidents. I suspect it's more now. What's most tragic is it can happen to anyone at any time, and it is completely avoidable through better driving behaviors, but design and street design can really enhance safety. And besides accidents being tragic, they're also very expensive. You can lose some valuable, young, economically productive people from road traffic accidents. The cost of road traffic accidents in 2019 was $467 million. And if we want to improve safety, we need to understand the relationship between speed, driving speed, and safety. The higher you drive, the more likely you are to have an accident, and the more likely that accident is going to be severe. And that's because when you go fast, you reduce your field of view. So if you drive slowly, You can process a lot more information about your surroundings. And as you go faster, you can see less and less. It becomes blurry. So if I'm driving down the street at 50 kilometers an hour, it could be something as simple as a street dog runs out. I might not see it, or I might not be able to slow down in time, and that can cause an accident. Or if you're to hit someone, speed also is a big factor. So if you're driving 80 kilometers an hour, the risk of death is essentially 100%. 50 kilometers an hour, roughly 50%. And as you go slower and slower, the risk of pedestrian death goes down considerably. And that's in part because the faster you go, the longer it takes you to stop. So you see less, and it takes you longer to stop. And so we can have a lot of road traffic fatalities caused just by speed. And I'm suggesting that we drive slower. And many people might think, well, I don't want to drive slower. It takes me longer to get to my destination. But if everybody is driving slower, we slow down the average speed. It can, in some instances, reduce your average journey time, because congestion is often caused by vehicles coming together. Once you stop the flow, you create waves of congestion, and it slows down movement through the network. And so sometimes driving slow can get you to your location faster. It's counterintuitive. If you're interested in that, there's a concept called gemology that explains why driving slower is faster. So how can we improve safety? Through design, we have different options. This general topic is referred to as traffic calming. And it's essentially calming down traffic using different street design configurations. And there's many different options. I'll give you a few examples. So one obvious one is narrowing the lane. The wider the road, the faster people tend to drive. You make it more narrow, they will drive slower. And if you narrow your lanes, you can free up space for other activities. That's one option. Then when it comes to intersections, the speed at which vehicles turn depends on the radius at which they can turn. And if you want to slow down a vehicle, you can create a more narrow radius. So here you can see most intersections are 3 to 5 meters, the radius, which allows you to corner reasonably fast. Some in Phnom Penh are more than 5 meters, so you can really take the corner at a very high speed, which is quite dangerous. If you really want to slow down traffic, you should opt for around 1.5 meters. So you drive towards the intersection, you really slow down, you take your turn, and then you speed up. That really increases safety, and it's good because if you narrow the radius, you also make the pedestrian crossing distance shorter. So cars drive slower, people walk less far, they're at less risk when they cross the street. And something as simple as that can go a long way in making your streets safer. Here's an example. This is in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. A vehicle turning here can go very fast, and this person is quite vulnerable. So we saw that as a big problem, and using paint and plants, and we'll explore what exactly is going on here later on. Using those, we made it much more narrow and slowed down the vehicle speeds and reduced this crossing distance. Another option, not at the intersection where roads meet, this is the mid-block, in the middle of a block. There's also ways you can slow down vehicles. This is a pinch point where basically for a small segment, we create a narrower roadway. A car approaching this way or then that way will have to slow down, and it's also a good location to put in a crossing. So that's another option. We can also look at mini roundabouts. They essentially force vehicles to slow down a little bit as they enter the intersection. Instead of driving straight through the intersection very fast, you force vehicles to slow down a little bit. That can increase pedestrian safety. Other traffic calming methods, some are less obvious. Planting trees. They alter our perception. We feel like we're in a more confined space, and we're more inclined to drive slower when we're surrounded by trees. Trees are also very calming, and trees are also good because they provide shelter, shade, and they can improve air and noise quality. This is a street in Hanoi in Vietnam. I can imagine myself driving a little bit slower down this street because of the trees. Then another option, this one's a bit more unusual, is to have chicanes, basically creating S-shaped paths to force vehicles to slow down. And there's examples of this in Singapore. So that's another way to calm traffic. Speed humps and speed tables, you've probably come across. They exist more and more in Phnom Penh and some of the Bores as well. It's very simple. It's just a mound of tarmac, normally around 15 centimeters high, and it forces people to slow down. A better option is a table like this. These have a flat top, and it's a nice opportunity to create a better pedestrian crossing. So this is kind of a pinch point with a raised crossing, and you slow down vehicles, you make crossing safer. And another example from Singapore, you can see a lot of good things going on, and we'll revisit that later. So that's safety. A big component of good non-motorized transport depends on managing traffic. And next, what we need is good footpaths. Footpaths, we know what they are just from living in cities. They are part of the streetscape next to the building edge, and they play a very important role for the movement of people, but also access to the buildings. And there's different types of footpaths. Residential areas have different needs. In neighborhoods, you have also different needs, and commercial streets like this one also have different design needs. And we will focus more on commercial footpaths. I think they're most interesting and relevant. And they're also spaces where there's the greatest opportunity for redesign and traffic calming. So footpaths can be broken down into different zones. And you can see them highlighted here in the different colors. You have the frontage zone. So this is the building edge here. And this is the zone immediately in front of the building. So it could be immediately in front of the shop. Shops often have posters or plants, and that would exist in the frontage zone. Here we have some kind of restaurant or coffee shop, and it occupies part of the frontage zone. So this is not where people move. And in the Phnom Penh configuration, the frontage zone seems to be the entire footpath at the moment. So it'd be nice if we can reclaim some of that space. The next zone is, in this case, the pedestrian zone. This is, or should be, an unobstructed path. Pedestrians should always have a right-of-way that is continuous. And so that's the pedestrian zone. In a residential street, it should be at least 1.8 meters. In a commercial area, it could be more. Really depends on the volume, but anything beyond 2.4 meters. And the reason in part is for accessible mobility. Say you want your pedestrian right-of-way to be wide enough for 2 wheelchairs to go past each other, or 1 wheelchair to be able to comfortably turn around. And so you need to maintain a clear right-of-way of 1.8 onwards. Then you can have a furniture zone. In a busy commercial street, people will maybe want to sit. So you should provide benches. Some benches should be in the sun, some should be in the shade. Sometimes first thing in the morning, you want to sit and enjoy some sunshine. And so you should have a mix. You also need lights. Lights, they improve safety. At nighttime, a well-illuminated street has less crime, generally. But also, if you include more lights, there will be more people. If there are more people, there's more potential business with the shops. And so by providing good illumination, you can extend the hours of business, and good business is good for the economy. So that happens in the furniture zone. Here you can also have bins. You could have your utilities. You often need telecommunication boxes or access to the drainage pipes. So this could be located somewhere in the furniture zone. And then you have a buffer zone. So the space next to the curb. In this case, we have enough space for a bicycle path. So there's a bicycle path here. There's also some green infrastructure. This can be good for absorbing rainwater, for example, and separating people from the roadway. And there's also different elements. So here we have one element that's active frontages. We should, in a commercial street, design the ground floors to be attractive, and that's a good thing. If you have shops with nice windows showing their products, it creates a nicer streetscape, and if it's nicer, there will be more people, there will be more business. Again, lighting is good, prolongs business hours. Seating in the street furniture zone, and also green infrastructure, which could be in the form of trees that creates shade. It can absorb rainwater, it cleans the air, and has many different benefits. And when we're also considering planting trees, you can give thought to different types of trees. Generally, palm trees are not good for providing shade, so avoid palm trees if your objective is shade, while you have different types of trees that can provide much better shade or protection from the wind and the rain. When we zoom out, that was really a cross-section. Now we can see more of a street that is not necessarily a commercial street, but a street in an urban area, and this is what it could look like. So again, we have a clear pedestrian right-of-way, no obstructions. So you can comfortably walk up and down. You have your crossing, and the crossing you can see here bulbs out. It's a tabletop crossing, so we've reduced the crossing distance, we've slowed down vehicles. We've also added some bollards here, so maybe cars and motorbikes can't drive up onto the footpath and park. It means it's nice and comfortable to walk down here, cross the street. In the middle here, we'll revisit this. There's also a refuge island. If there's many cars driving, sometimes you don't want to cross from here to there in one go, and it's good to take a break here. So when it's clear, you walk here, you wait until it's clear here, then you cross again. That's called a refuge island, where you take refuge, you find safety. Another element of a footpath is the surfacing. This was in Ethiopia. They used very thin pavings, and thin pavings are cheaper, but they break. So after 2 or 3 years, these were very prone to break. Then they switched to smaller paving stones that were thicker, but they didn't hold well together. And this was in 2017. If they didn't fix it, I'm sure the street is maybe up to here now. So a better option is to use thick blocks, pavings, and have them interlocking. So these are just small things to think about to provide a smooth surface for different non-motorized modes of transport. So those are footpaths. Next up, we have crossings. So when you're not on the footpath, chances are you're crossing a street when you enter mixed traffic, and for that, you need pedestrian crossings. You should provide pedestrian crossings wherever there is a need, a concentrated need for people to cross. So generally at intersections, or at all intersections, you should have a crossing. Sometimes you should have a mid-block crossing if there is a demand. And there's often demands around bus stops. So if there was a bus stop here, good to have a crossing here. And crossings in a network of streets should be 80 to 100 meters apart. And if we can do that, we can create a nice interconnected network of footpaths and crossings, and then it becomes possible to walk to and from different places quite comfortably. Here we have Norodom, and you can see there are no crossings. There's one crossing here, but for several hundred meters, there are no crossing opportunities. If I live here and I want to see my neighbor, I have to walk here, cross here, no crossing, cross over here, come back, and it takes me 15, 20 minutes. Chances are I will take my motorbike. And when it comes to creating crossings, they also have elements that we should try to include. So visible markings, you want the crossing to be visible for pedestrians and drivers. I like this one. It also visually tells the driver that there is a ramp, a gradient. If it's a faster moving street, then traffic lights are good for both the vehicles and pedestrians. Illumination is important. Here, I don't know if there's street lights, maybe there are. I do see a light here to warn vehicles, to tell them that they are entering a pedestrian crossing. Again, the pedestrian here has been given quite a short route. There's some green infrastructure. So that's elements of a good crossing. What we often look to as a solution in emerging cities is these pedestrian elevated walkways. I'm not a big fan. Phnom Penh is building lots and lots of them. Have you seen them? I'm sure you've seen them. Have you used them? Some people do, but a lot of people, they still just cross and climb over this. It's just a really expensive solution that people often don't end up using because it's, quite a journey to go over them. You have to climb upstairs, walk across, climb down, and oftentimes, even me, I just choose to cross anywhere and climb over the median, the barrier here. From an engineering point of view, yes, it's kind of a solution, but in reality, a lot of people just don't use them. It might just be better to create a proper crossing and find better ways to manage traffic and maintain traffic flow. Another type of crossing at an intersection, we have conventional crossings. This is a very standard crossing. Here we have an example. Your crossing should align with your pedestrian right-of-way. It's at grade, which means it's at level with the road. There's a small ramp here, and you can see those here. So it's accessible by wheelchair. So this is a good conventional intersection. This is more elaborate. This is a diagonal crossing, sometimes known as a pedestrian scramble. Here we have an example in Kuala Lumpur, and it's inspired by Shibuya. I don't know if you've ever heard of Shibuya in Tokyo. And it's basically a crossing that you could introduce if there's very high pedestrian volumes. So here, there's McDonald's, there's a shopping street, there's a market, there's restaurants here, very busy area. And the way this crossing works is you have a phase where no vehicles are here. All the lights are red and all the pedestrians just spill into this space. It's quite fascinating to watch. At mid-blocks, so not at intersections, here's another option. This is a staggered crossing. And staggered means it's off alignment. Basically, it forces you to cross in 2 stages. You walk from here, stage 1, you arrive here on the refuge island. You have to turn, and when you turn, you face traffic. So you see vehicles coming towards you, and then you can do your second stage. So it's a safe way to cross a busy street. So this is in Hong Kong. This is an intersection, which is quite unusual, but you can really see how you would cross this in 2 stages, and they've included barriers to sort of guide you. And we mentioned refuge islands. Again, these are great because you can cross in several stages. Any street that has more than 3 lanes on either side should have a refuge island. These refuge islands can be designed with different features. This one is protected by this curb with vegetation. You could also have bollards, so metal poles essentially, to provide a bit more protection. This is similar. This is a tip at the median that's protruding, so it provides you with a safer space when you're here. And again, a very similar example where the median, they've basically cut through the median to create a crossing. And so we looked at footpaths and crossings. Now we need to think about how we can link everything together at a larger scale. When we want to create cities that promote non-motorized mobility, we need to create interconnected networks of footpaths and crossings at quite a large scale. So we have to look at networks and blocks. And when I say blocks, a block is the space within the street pattern of a city that is subdivided into land lots for buildings. In Phnom Penh, you have blocks of different sizes. You have larger blocks, smaller blocks, and if you want to create well interconnected network of roads, be it for walking, even motorbikes, the smaller the block, the better. But obviously by motorbike, you move faster, so a bigger block is less of an issue. But if you're walking, around 110 meters is favorable. So if this is 110 meters and I want to go here, I can take lots of different routes, which is good. When we look at it in the context of Phnom Penh, so again, my morning walk was from here to there, and the blocks here are 250 meters. So it's quite a big block, and 50 meters here, 150 meters here. It's really quite okay. If I could walk comfortably, if I had a continuous footpath, this would be a great place to walk and shop and live and socialize. Unfortunately, because the footpaths are so obstructed, walking here is very inefficient. Sometimes you have very large blocks and you want to enhance the connectivity, and for that there's also interesting solutions. So in Phnom Penh, in the last few years, there's been so much development. These blocks have a lot of small houses. A lot of them are being knocked down and replaced with big towers, big developments, malls in some cases. And whenever you build, say, a big mall here, maybe there's an opportunity to create a passageway through the mall from one side of the block to the other. And you see these often in Japan. They're called arcades, where you build essentially a passageway. In this case, it's a very busy shopping street through a building, and then you can use it if you want to go shopping, or if you just want to get to the other street. Then this example, this is in Singapore. There's a shopping mall, and inside the shopping mall, there's a bicycle lane that you can only use from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. when it's not too busy, and it helps you cut through a block and can reduce your travel time. And when you do that, you increase what we call urban permeability. It's basically how easily you can move from one point to another and how many options you have to do it. And the more options you have, generally the better. This is what a good network of streets could look like, where you have good footpaths and crossings, but you might have some streets that are only for pedestrians, which might be good if you're trying to walk somewhere and you want to be away from vehicles. You can also have plazas, and this is what your network could really look like. It's a mix of spaces that help you move comfortably, but also spaces where you can stop and relax and meet friends and go for coffee. And to do that, you also need to better manage traffic. So it's great to have all this walking infrastructure, but it's a balanced approach. You also have to think of vehicles, because you'll have to restrict them and give some thought to how and where they can drive. And you might have to create slow driving zones. So a nice case study for this is Kota Tua in Jakarta, the old center of Jakarta. This is this area, which in the last few years they've turned into a low emission zone. This used to be a very busy car street. Now you have a very wide pedestrian walkway, and it's very busy. It's a touristy area. Away from this main area, the streets also have new cycle paths, which are very nice. You have blocked streets, and they've restricted the way vehicles can drive. Some streets are closed. Some streets are now one direction, and they've essentially created a low emission zone in this very popular touristy area. Maybe there's ideas that could be explored in Phnom Penh. We spoke a lot about accessibility and inclusivity. So when we are designing city streets, we should try to cater to the most vulnerable users. If you design your city around someone in a wheelchair, then everyone more or less will benefit. So design around the most vulnerable users and you will create a very good streetscape for everybody. And so we saw how we can have ramps that are leading to the street. They should be included everywhere at all the crossings, and the ramps should have, say, a 10% gradient. They should be a certain width, etc. Then another impairment that's common is visual impairments. You have people who are partially or completely blind. For them to navigate streets independently, there are elements and methods to help guide them. And you do see these in Phnom Penh. But if they're not continuous, they're very hard to use. But they're essentially called tactile strips, and they communicate to visually impaired people when they can go and where they should stop, and they really help navigate the streets. So universal accessibility is something very important and should be used to help people move through streets, but also access public transport. So this again is the Trans-Jakarta BRT that we saw last week. And this is where the car-free day happens. This is where they move a significant number of people through the city. And it's also accessible for people in wheelchairs and blind people. So here you have a 10% gradient. Might be a bit tight here, but it looks manageable, which can give them access to the elevators. Access to the station is also on a not very steep ramp, and you can see the tactile strips at different locations. And then very lastly, we spoke mostly about how we can move through space, but sometimes you don't want to move. Sometimes you want to take a break. You want to sit, read a book, meet a friend, have a meeting, not in the office space. And for that, you probably want to be in an enjoyable public space. And there's different ways we can reclaim space. One option is creating public plazas. In many cities, there are unused islands. So here there's some kind of traffic island, and in this example, they've closed it off here to traffic, and they've created a new public space. A little park where you can go, sit, go for coffee, sit in the shade, and it's nice. If you live here, this is a nice place to be able to go. If you don't have a balcony in your apartment, you come, you hang out, you have a good time. Another option that could be explored, again, as part of a parking management strategy is parklets. A parklet is essentially a public space that is roughly the size of 2 or 3 parking spaces. So this is maybe the street before. We did a parking management strategy, and here, without taking up much space, we can create a nice public space where people can go and have their coffee and play chess, do whatever they want to do. So very simple and very effective. Then there's some more radical ways we can reclaim public space, and there's some excellent case studies out there. This is the New York High Line. Back in the 90s, this was a railway line that was no longer used. So trains used to move along here. In 1999, the city said, we will destroy it, trains don't use this anymore. Local residents got together with architects and created an idea for a public park in the sky, and the idea gained a lot of momentum. The city wasn't sure. Obviously, it's expensive to retrofit an old railway line into a public park, but they convinced them, and it's 2.4 kilometers long, provides a passageway through Western Manhattan, and you can exit at different locations. You might think, this is nice, but it's expensive. But you build this, it's extremely popular, nice to look at, it's a pleasant space, and because of it, land values around it have gone up. People have to pay more rent. More rent means more tax income for the government, and tax income can be used to cross-subsidize and finance projects like this. So you build something nice, it pays for itself. This project has inspired many projects around the world. In Seoul, South Korea, you can see a similar project. This used to be a highway, part of a elevated interchange, and you can see that this was used by cars once upon a time. They created a beautiful urban park. I made a little video documenting this place. Another very famous example is Cheon. Very long time ago, it used to be a stream. They built a big highway on it. They were able to close the highway and create a new beautiful public space. And again, it's a similar story. This was a horrible place to live. Now it's become a very attractive place to live. Land values have gone up. It helps to cross-subsidize these nice projects. If you have time or for your homework, you can check out these videos. They provide really nice case studies, and I'm sure ideas can come up for things we could do in Phnom Penh. And another way to reclaim public space is through tactical urbanism. And it's essentially a city or a citizen-led approach to test and demonstrate changes in our street. And you can see here, using chalk and cones, they have reconfigured this intersection to test out what it could be like with more public space, tighter radii to slow down vehicles, very low cost, very simple. And this is something we are looking at in Phnom Penh. So street design best practices, we looked at safety, footpaths, crossings, networks, accessibility, public space. We only covered a tiny fraction of what we could have covered. This is a huge topic. We didn't talk about parking. We didn't talk about signs and wayfinding, lighting, green infrastructure, how we can integrate utilities, because it's great if you make a nice footpath, but if 1 week later someone comes, digs up the street to fix the waterworks, that's problematic. There's good ways to manage utilities. We didn't talk so much about vendors, but there are ways we can integrate them nicely. Freight and transit. So these are all the things we didn't talk about, which we could have talked about and we can talk about in the future, just because it's very relevant to Cambodia. There's many street vendors. Their daily life depends on them being able to sell on the streets. And oftentimes when we plan and design our streets, we don't factor them in our plans because it's common that governments don't want them to exist. Often they don't pay tax. So it's better to find ways to integrate them than to eradicate them because their lives depend on this. And one very simple method is to manage carefully where they can locate and where they can't. In Chennai in India, they have used paint, and vendors are not allowed to spill out into the pedestrian right-of-way. That's something that's very easy to introduce. You do need a policeman to move up and down and enforce it, but very quickly you could reclaim space. Or something more complex, more longer term is integrating them in, say, a hawker center. So in Singapore, you have many different hawker centers, which are essentially spaces that were created for what used to be street vendors. And now they've brought them together into centers, and they haven't eradicated the street vendors, they've integrated them, and it's become quite a cultural phenomenon, and it's where many people go for more affordable food. And then there's one city that I find really interesting. It's a city that's completely full of motorbikes. This is known as the Scooter Waterfall, and it's a very rich city. It has the 6th highest GDP per capita in the world. Taiwan is doing very well, but they're still driving motorbikes. They don't feel the need to buy a car. They're happy with their motorbikes because it's a very convenient vehicle. So Taiwan is home to 15 million motorbikes, and statistically, every single adult in Taiwan owns a motorbike. At least for me, it caught me by surprise because generally, the wealthier a country gets, the less likely it is to have scooters. And you have countries like Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh is the motorcycle capital of the world. But Taiwan also has a very high share of motorbikes, despite it being a high-income country. There's nothing wrong with that. It's great. Two-wheelers are fast, they're flexible, they're cheap, they're really ideal for short to medium distances. That's why we all use them here. But what they've done in Taipei is they've integrated them really well with mass transit. You can park your bike in many different designated areas and interchange onto buses, onto their BRT, onto their metro, and these mass transit options are great for medium to long distance trips. So it's very normal to have your motorbike and also use public transport. And having so many motorbikes could be problematic, but they really enforce where and how you can park using paint, and it creates quite an organized streetscape. You can see the pedestrian right-of-way is still kept clear, and you're still parking many, many motorbikes. This could absolutely work in Phnom Penh. And also when you're in motion on the motorbikes, the intersections, for example, have a motorbike box where you can idle and wait for the light to turn green. They've designed the streets to cater for them, not get rid of them, which is the approach in many ASEAN cities. Then the back streets, you have a lot of shared streets like this, where they have pedestrian footpaths. I don't know if I'm a big fan of this. I haven't spent enough time in Taipei to know if I like this. But without spending much money, just using paint, they have sort of organized their streets. And it seems to work quite well. You're not allowed to park here, so no vehicles are parked. And it maintains a clear right-of-way for pedestrians and vehicles. They also have many car-free streets and really high-quality cycling infrastructure. And the problem with many cities is we expect you to use public transport and you will drive to public transport with your motorbike. But then when you take the public transport to your destination, you don't have a way to get to your final destination, which means you don't take the public transport in the first place. So what they've done well is there's also sharing systems. So they have a bicycle sharing system that's very extensive. Outside every public transport station, you can rent a bike. And there's very good cycle paths everywhere in the city. But sometimes you want to do a longer trip than you may want to do on a bicycle in the tropical heat. And for that, they also have an electric moped sharing system, which we have in Phnom Penh. And that was inspired by Gogoro, the system in Taipei. There's a lot we can learn from Taipei. They show us that you can have a lot of motorbikes and have public transport and have a good walking environment. So I think we'll take a little break here. Thank you. That was a long A long first hour and 15 minutes.
Thanks for watching. SMMR is an ASEAN-German cooperation project implemented by GFA Consulting Group and partners on behalf of GIZ. For more information on the SMMR project, do consider checking out www.summer.asia. We look forward to seeing you there.